Frank Hyder is a well-known, renowned visual artist. When he started to become an artist, he thought the journey would be a straightforward progression. Over the years, he has discovered that the road has many twists and turns, numerous hills and valleys, and countless challenges. Through this series of short stories, tales, and remembrances, his hope is that these will offer some valuable insight into the life of an artist and what's involved in becoming an artist. In the end, he has come to realize that he is not a painter or sculptor or anything in particular. He is more simply a creative person with great passion and love for the process of making art concerning people and the world around us, who shares his artworks with the public. Join us now as we listen to another episode of A Life in Art series.
Mentors. The role that mentors play in developing an artist is really immense. It's a topic that is impossible to really summarize and to describe in an analytical way. But I will say that I was blessed by having had some mentors. I had talked in an earlier one of these about Henry and George and Frida, who were the first artists that I ever met, and all of the impact that they had had on helping me get to that place where I could go to art school and try to become an artist. But then the first real mentor I had in art school was Abby Sangiamo, who was a one of Joseph Alber's star students from Yale. He was the head of the drawing program at the Maryland Institute, and I had already talked about how I was in his class, and I absolutely thought he was not like no teacher I'd ever seen in my life. He had this class. We had about 35 students in the room. By today's standards, way overcrowded. And every week we start the class with a long critique. So we would get a written homework assignment with clearly stated goals, definition of a scale, material use, and then we had to make a big drawing that resolved all of the questions that he put in the assignment. Then we had to come into the room, and before we did anything else, had to hang them on the wall. And then he would begin each class by talking about each and every one of the drawings. And sometimes he was not as positive as others, but he always could find something in the drawing to build on. We all looked forward to those meetings because we learned as he talked about other people's drawings as much as when he talked about our drawings. And what was really great about Abby is he was such a character. He was a Brooklyn boy. He always came into the school. He was always dressed wearing a jacket, and he had a little tie, and he was always kind of very formal. But he spoke about life on the street. He talked about movies. He talked about gangsters. He talked about politics. And what he was really doing was reminding each and every one of us that when we were in that room, all those ideas that he talked about still were in the world. And if we had anything in us, those ideas would gradually find their way into our work. And that the work would have not just what we were doing by looking at something and trying to draw it, but it would have the emotional content and impact and connection to the real world outside. So when you got to his class in the morning, class started at 9. The door was closed. If you came at 5 minutes after 9, you could not get in. You sat on the floor outside the door until he opened the door, whenever that would be. It might be an hour, it might be an hour and a half. Whatever it was, he would open the door. You could get in at that point. But if you didn't have your drawing on the wall, you got no credit for the day. So you had to get your drawing up. Everybody came in every day and you put up your drawing and you waited for that review or that interaction. Well, anyway, I took Abby for every class I could, I found him to be an absolute wellspring of information. There was no limit to his knowledge about classical drawing, about drawing techniques, about process. But the most memorable thing he ever did for me was he really talked about scale in drawings, and he had us make huge drawings, like drawings that made no sense in the form of drawing that I had known before. So we were making drawings that were 5 by 6 feet on big paper, and we were making them using lines. And he'd talk about these lines crossing the form, and I can remember him describing that if we really wanted to understand how a form looked, we should imagine that we were an ant and we had to crawl across that form. So every bump, every lump, we had to appreciate it the way an ant walking across an irregular surface was able to negotiate that space. And it made an enormous impact on me, and I still see traces of it in my work today, is that impact of those cross-contour lines, those big lines that moved across the form and recorded its ups and downs. And so that was a big part of that learning process. Another feature was that he was always enthusiastic. As you came up with a new move in your work, he would encourage you to explore that and then point you to a bunch of references that you could look at for guidance. Artists who had gone that way before and had picked up on something and taken it to another place. And that gave you a point of contact. I found out also that he was a big mentor to a really very famous American artist by the name of Jeff Koons. And so we were in school at the same time. Jeff Koons was he was younger than me, so he was not in my class. But anyway, this guy, Abby Sangiamo, had everybody's attention. He commanded. He taught during the daytime. He taught drawing and painting. Then he taught a night class. So he brought people in from the outside who were working at jobs who would come in to draw. And he was always very invigorating, very challenging, very informative, and always 100% enthusiastic. He really was a no nonsense focus. And I learned so much from that experience. And years later, I was invited to the Maryland Institute when he was retiring from teaching. So I went to the Institute, and I had come up from Florida, and I went, and I figured there'd be 400 or 500 people there. I thought that'll be, an appropriate goodbye. And when I got there, I discovered that there really wasn't going to be like that. It was going to be like a luncheon with board members, and the only other artist that was there was Jeff Koons. Now, at that time, Jeff Koons was absolutely the most famous artist in New York City, and he was there, kind of one of the golden boys of the art world, and everybody wanted to be close to him. They wanted to talk to him. Everybody was paying him attention. So at a certain point, I was standing and I saw Abby, and he saw me, and he came over, and he said to me how it was nice to see me. And I said, "Look, it's great to see you. I haven't seen you for a really long time. You look terrific. I'm really glad that I could be here today." And I said, "Abby, I have a question for you, and I'd like you to give me an answer." And he said, "What's that?" I said, "Well, I know why he's here." And I pointed over to Jeff Koons standing on the other side of the room. But I said, "Why in the world am I here if it's just him and I?" And he said, "Well, the answer to that question is you're here because I want you here. And you're here because in 50 years of teaching, you were someone that I really remember and had in my memory, and I wanted to be here today." And he said, "Now, regards him," he said, "I have a question for you. How come you're not making as much money with your work as he is with his?" And I realized that once again, he had turned the page on me and made me think about the thing that I hadn't been thinking about, and not focusing on myself, but rather think about my work and how I could make it better. Anyway, I had a great day that day. We had a luncheon, and the first person to speak was Jeff Koons, and he gave a little speech, and then the people went around the room and gave speeches, and somehow or another, I was the very last person to speak. And as I stood to address the room, I brought up the fact. I said, your classroom was a classroom that we showed up on time for because we knew you would close the door and not let us in if we were 1 minute late. And we wanted to be with you. We didn't want to just take your class. We wanted to be in that class. And then when you closed that door and you began to talk about those drawings, you pulled all the world through the windows and through the doors of that building, and you put them in the room with us and reminded us as we drew that the world outside needed to be considered in what we were doing. We couldn't be distracted by it, but we needed to understand it, contain it, and put it into our content in some way or another. That art didn't exist in a vacuum. It needed to be made in solitude, but it needed to refer to the multitude. And as I finished my thoughts, Jeff Koons came over and hugged me, and he said, "Well, you said what we all really wanted to say." And I felt that it was kind of a nice moment. And I left that day with some good memories of the past and a really good memory of that day. The next time that I had an interaction with Abby was a couple of years later, and I had gotten a notice that he was having a book release, and they were going to have a party in Baltimore, and I got an invitation to this book release. And at the time, I was in a wheelchair because I had been hit by a car and my legs were broken. So getting there for that event was going to be difficult. So I wrote to somebody at the school, and I said, "Look, can you give me his phone number? I'll try to give him a call." They gave me his phone number, and I called him on the phone, and he answered the phone. And he says to me on the phone, he says, "Well, I was waiting to hear from you." And I said, "Well, I'm glad you are." And I explained, I can't come because I'm in a wheelchair. And then we proceeded to have a really terrific conversation. And I got off the phone, and I remember my wife coming into the room and saying something to me. I said, "Look, I'm sitting in this chair right now, but for the last hour and a half, I've been flying around this room with my old mentor, and we've been talking and talking about ideas, and I just really felt like I could fly during that period of time." And I had promised him that when I was better, I would come to visit him. So as the months progressed, I did finally, I was walking again and things were going well. So I made plans to go to Baltimore. And I got the chairman of the art department, the painting department, to take me to Abby at the time was 91 years old, and he was living in not an assisted living, but he was living in a house where he had somebody who would look after him, and he was still pretty much mentally all together. He was just a little frail. So anyway, we went to visit him, and I spent we spent some time talking, and we were going over different ideas from teaching and from the school. And then he wanted to know what I was doing, and I was showing him some pictures of the work I was making. He became very, very animated and very excited. And he wanted to know what critics were thinking of my work, what kind of responses they were getting. And we talked and shared some of those thoughts. And then at a certain point, he stops and he looks at me and he said, "I've known a lot of artists in my life." And he said, "I think you're the most creative person that I've had the pleasure of knowing." And I said, "Abby, I know that's not true. It's awful nice of you to say it. And in the end, I've been blessed by having had the opportunity of knowing you and working with you and sharing over all these years this opportunity." And so as I bid him farewell, it was the last time I would see him. But, the other thing he said to me, he says, "I don't get many visitors like you." He said, you're full of life, and you have lots of conversation and ideas. And he said, "Most of my visitors are very dour and sort of quiet." And he said, "This has really been a great fun for me." And as I said, I left him that day. I never saw him again. He died shortly thereafter. But in the end, I carry a memory of him with me forever, and the things he taught me, the ideas he shared with me, I really do hope that they're part of the life that I live as a working artist, and I hope that I've been able to reach out to other artists and share some of the gifts that were shared with me in that mentoring situation.
Thank you for listening. If you have questions or suggestions for future episodes, please reach out to Frank Hyder on Facebook or Instagram. We hope to see you at one of the next A Life in Art episodes.